Niemand verlässt die Avenue Foch lebend. Aber an diesem Tag ist jemand entkommen. Die Frage ist, wie?
Paris, October 12, 1943. The SS headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch was the most feared address in occupied France. It was where the Gestapo brought resistance fighters for interrogation, where torture rooms operated day and night, where screams echoed through elegant Parisian hallways that had once hosted literary salons and diplomatic receptions. No one entered that building voluntarily. No one walked out alive unless the Nazis decided they were useful. And yet on that autumn morning, a 31-year-old woman named Nancy Wake walked through the front door, sat across from SS officers for 3 hours of questioning, and walked back out onto the street as if she'd merely been applying for a permit. The story of how she did this, and what she did before and after, is one of the most extraordinary tales of courage and deception that World War II ever produced. Nancy Grace Augusta Wake was born in New Zealand in 1912, but she grew up in Australia with a childhood that gave no indication she would become one of the war's most decorated resistance fighters. She was rebellious from early age, running away from home at 16, with money she'd saved from working odd jobs, determined to see the world beyond the confines of her strict religious upbringing. She made her way to New York, then London, then Paris, working as a freelance journalist and living the kind of free, adventurous life that women of her generation were rarely permitted. In Paris, she fell in love with a wealthy French industrialist named Avenue Foch, married him in 1939, and settled into what should have been a comfortable, conventional life of dinner parties and social obligations. But Nancy Wake was fundamentally incapable of conventional anything. When Germany invaded France in 1940 and the occupation began, she watched Nazi officers parade through Paris streets and felt something inside her crystallize into pure rage. She had been in Vienna in 1933 as a journalist and witnessed Nazi brown shirts beating Jewish civilians in the streets. She had seen the casual cruelty, the systematic dehumanization, the crowds of ordinary people who either participated or looked away. That memory had never left her, and now those same people were occupying France, imposing the same brutality on her adopted country. She made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would fight them with everything she had, regardless of risk, regardless of consequence. Her husband Henri was supportive but terrified for her safety. He had wealth, connections, influence, that could keep them relatively comfortable even under occupation. He begged her to stay quiet, to survive, to wait out the war like everyone else. Nancy listened to his arguments and ignored everyone. She began working with the French resistance in early 1941, initially as a courier carrying messages and documents between resistance cells in southern France. It seemed like relatively safe work, less dangerous than sabotage or armed operations. But couriers were arrested constantly, and when the Gestapo caught them, they were tortured until they revealed names, locations, contacts, everything that would allow Nazis to roll up entire resistance networks. Nancy proved exceptionally good at not getting caught. She had natural talent for deception that combined fearlessness with quick thinking and an actress's ability to become whatever character the situation required. She could be a scattered housewife who'd forgotten her papers at home, a flirtatious young woman distracting German soldiers with conversation while documents were hidden in her clothing, a haughty aristocrat demanding to speak to their superior officer. She understood instinctively that authority was performance, that if you acted like you belonged somewhere, most people would assume you did. Within months, she was doing far more than carrying messages. She was smuggling Allied airmen who'd been shot down over France, guiding them through safe houses and across the Pyrenees into Spain, where they could eventually return to England. She helped move Jewish children from Paris to the countryside, providing false papers and connections to families who would hide them. She transported weapons, explosives, money, radio equipment, anything the resistance needed. And she did all of this while maintaining her cover as wealthy socialite wife of Avenue Foch, attending parties where German officers were guests, smiling and making small talk while memorizing their faces and conversations for intelligence reports. The Gestapo knew someone was operating in the region. They called her the White Mouse because she slipped through their traps with impossible consistency. They knew she existed, knew she was responsible for helping hundreds of Allied airmen escape, knew she was connected to multiple resistance cells, but they couldn't identify her. They arrested suspects, tortured them for information, executed dozens of people trying to find the White Mouse. But Nancy had compartmentalized her operations so carefully that no single person knew enough to betray her completely. Even within the resistance, very few people knew her real name or her connection to Avenue Foch. By 1943, the net was tightening. German counterintelligence had become more sophisticated, more systematic. They were infiltrating resistance groups, turning arrested members into double agents, using radio detection equipment to locate clandestine transmitters. Nancy had close calls with increasing frequency. She was stopped at checkpoints and searched. She was followed by plainclothes Gestapo. She was questioned multiple times, each interrogation a performance where one mistake could mean torture and execution. And she knew that eventually someone would talk. Some arrested resistance member would give up enough information that the Gestapo would connect Nancy Wake to the White Mouse. The moment that connection happened came in September 1943. A resistance contact was arrested and, under torture, revealed that the White Mouse might be connected to Avenue Foch's social circle. It wasn't definitive information, but it was enough for the Gestapo to start investigating. They began watching the Foch household, following Nancy when she left the apartment, checking her papers more carefully at checkpoints. Henri begged her to flee to England while she still could. Nancy refused. She had operations in progress, people depending on her, commitments she wouldn't abandon. She believed she could continue working while managing the increased scrutiny. Then came the summons. In early October, a letter arrived at the Foch apartment requiring Nancy Wake to report to SS headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch for routine questioning regarding her travel within France. It was not technically an arrest, merely an administrative interview, but everyone knew what 84 Avenue Foch really was. Routine questioning could easily become indefinite detention. People who went there for interviews often never came home. Henri was certain this was the end, that the Gestapo had finally identified her, and this summons was the trap closing. He wanted her to disappear immediately, to use the resistance networks she'd built to get out of Paris before the interview date. Nancy considered running. She had the means and the contacts to vanish within hours. But running would confirm suspicion and doom everyone connected to her. The Gestapo would arrest Henri, torture him for information about her escape route, probably execute him as punishment. They would round up everyone in her social circle, interrogate them all, destroy the carefully maintained fiction that she was just a socialite with no involvement in anything political. Running would save her but destroy the network she'd spent 3 years building. So she made a decision that seemed absolutely insane. She would keep the appointment, walk into Gestapo headquarters, and convince them she was exactly what her papers said she was. A wealthy woman with no connection to resistance activities. Henri thought she was committing suicide. Her resistance contacts thought she'd lost her mind. But Nancy understood something about Nazi psychology that gave her a slim chance of success. The Gestapo expected resistance fighters to be afraid, to run, to show signs of guilt. They relied on fear and intimidation to break people during interrogation. But if she showed no fear whatsoever, if she performed absolute confidence and aristocratic disdain for their authority, she might confuse them enough to create doubt. They suspected she might be the White Mouse, but they had no definitive proof. If she gave them nothing to confirm suspicion, if her performance was perfect, they might conclude they were wrong. On October 12, 1943, Nancy Wake dressed in her most expensive clothes, jewelry that marked her as wealthy and privileged, makeup carefully applied. She looked like someone going to lunch at an exclusive restaurant, not someone walking into the headquarters of the organization that had tortured and killed thousands. Henri drove her to Avenue Foch and waited outside in absolute terror while she walked through the entrance where SS guards checked her papers and directed her to an interrogation room on the second floor. The room was deliberately intimidating. Plain walls, harsh lighting, a table with chairs arranged so the interrogators would be backlit while she faced the light. 2 SS officers were waiting, their files spread on the table containing information about her movements, her associations, places she'd traveled. They studied her as she entered, looking for nervousness, fear, any sign that she knew she was in danger. Nancy sat down, crossed her legs elegantly, and looked at them with expression of mild annoyance, as if this interview was interrupting more important social obligations. The questioning began with routine biographical information. Where was she born? When did she come to France? What was her husband's occupation? Nancy answered each question with bored precision, occasionally checking her watch as if concerned about being late for lunch. The officers moved to her travel within France. She had been to Marseille 6 times in the past year, to Lyon 4 times, to Toulouse twice. Why so much travel? Nancy explained that her husband's business required entertaining clients throughout southern France, that she accompanied him on these trips, that surely they understood how tedious business obligations could be. She described hotels they'd stayed at, restaurants they'd dined in, dropping names of German officers they'd socialized with at various events. This was the calculated risk of her strategy. By mentioning German officers by name, she was either establishing her innocence through social connections or giving them leads to verify her story. If any of those officers remembered her differently than she described, if her story had inconsistencies they could check. She was finished. But Nancy had prepared for this moment for months, memorizing details of every social event she'd attended, every conversation she'd had with German officers, creating a coherent narrative that would withstand verification. The interrogators shifted to more specific questions. She had been seen in Marseille on dates that coincided with known resistance activities in that city. What exactly had she been doing on those dates? Nancy pulled out a small diary from her purse, an elegant leather-bound book where she'd carefully documented social engagements, dinners, shopping trips. She walked them through her schedule for each date they mentioned, showing them entries about visiting dress shops, having lunch with friends, attending a concert. The diary was real. The engagements were real. But what the interrogators didn't know was that between the lunch appointment and the concert, she'd been meeting with resistance contacts and smuggling documents. The questioning continued for over an hour, the officers probing for inconsistencies, returning to questions they'd asked earlier with slight variations to see if her answers changed. Nancy maintained perfect consistency because she was telling truth wrapped around lies. The framework of her story was real, verified by documents and witnesses. Only the gaps between verified events contained her resistance work, and those gaps were small enough that she could claim simple memory lapses or insignificant activities not worth recording. Then the interrogators produced photographs, images of people Nancy knew from resistance work, faces of contacts who'd been arrested or killed. Did she recognize any of these individuals? Nancy studied each photograph with expression of polite interest, occasionally commenting that someone looked vaguely familiar. Perhaps she'd seen them at a party or in a shop, but she couldn't place them specifically. This was the most dangerous part of the interrogation. Some of these people were friends, comrades she'd worked closely with. Showing no recognition required acting ability most professional actors couldn't manage. But Nancy understood that any hesitation, any emotional response, would confirm she knew them and invite deeper questioning about how. The officers watched her face carefully as she examined the photographs, looking for micro-expressions that would betray knowledge. Nancy gave them nothing. She had learned to control her reactions through dozens of checkpoint encounters and casual conversations with German officers where one wrong look could expose her. She handed the photographs back with a shrug, apologizing that she couldn't be more helpful, but surely they understood that one saw so many faces in Paris social life that it was impossible to remember everyone. After 2 hours, the interrogators' confidence was wavering. They had been certain this interview would break her, that confronted with evidence and surrounded by the atmosphere of Avenue Foch, where so many had confessed, she would show fear or crack under pressure. Instead, she sat there looking vaguely bored, occasionally checking her watch, treating the whole proceeding as a bureaucratic inconvenience. This wasn't how guilty people behaved. This wasn't how the White Mouse should react to being cornered. The senior interrogator tried a different approach. He described in detail what they did to resistance members in the basement of this building, the techniques they used to extract information, the pain they could inflict before death finally came as mercy. He explained that many women had sat in this same chair, defiant at first, and how they all eventually screamed the truth through broken teeth. He was trying to terrorize her into confession by making her imagine that fate. Nancy listened to this recitation of horrors with expression of aristocratic distaste, then asked if she could smoke. The interrogator, thrown off balance, nodded. Nancy pulled out a cigarette case, offered cigarettes to both officers with perfect courtesy, lit her own with steady hands, and suggested that perhaps they should focus on relevant questions rather than unpleasant theoretical scenarios. It was a power move that completely inverted the dynamic. She was supposed to be terrified. Instead, she was treating them like poorly behaved dinner guests who'd brought up inappropriate topics. The interrogators looked at each other, uncertain how to proceed. They had files suggesting she might be the White Mouse, but the woman in front of them showed absolutely no characteristics they associated with resistance fighters. She was wealthy, connected, dismissive of their authority in ways that suggested privilege rather than defiance. And most importantly, she showed no fear whatsoever. They tried for another hour, asking the same questions from different angles, looking for contradictions they could exploit. Nancy maintained her performance flawlessly, occasionally sighing with exasperation, once asking if they were nearly finished because she really did have a lunch appointment. Finally, the senior interrogator made a decision. They had no concrete evidence connecting this woman to resistance activities. The suspicion that had led to the interview was based on vague information from a tortured prisoner who might have been confused or lying to make torture stop. And this woman, whoever she was, clearly had connections to German officers who outranked the interrogators. Arresting her without evidence could cause political problems. He told Nancy she was free to go, but should remain available for further questioning if necessary. Nancy stood, thanked them for their time with ironic courtesy, and walked out of the interrogation room. She moved through the corridors of Avenue Foch with the same unhurried elegance she'd shown entering, nodding politely to SS guards, stepping out onto the street where Henry was waiting in the car, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 3 hours. She got in the passenger seat, waited until they'd driven several blocks, and then her hands started shaking so violently she had to clasp them together to make it stop. She had walked into the Gestapo headquarters and convinced the SS that she was innocent through pure performance. But she knew this was her last reprieve. The interrogators might not have arrested her, but they would continue investigating. They would check her story more thoroughly, talk to the officers she'd mentioned, look for any inconsistency. Eventually they would find something or someone would talk, and next time there would be no polite interview. Next time would be the basement and the torture rooms and the screaming that everyone in Avenue Foch learned to ignore. Henri begged her to leave France immediately. For once, Nancy agreed. She had pushed her luck as far as it would go. She said goodbye to Henri in November 1943, a farewell both knew might be permanent. He would stay in France to maintain their businesses and provide cover for her escape. She would try to reach England, and if she made it, join the Special Operations Executive to continue fighting in some other capacity. They held each other outside Marseille Station, and Nancy promised to return when the war was over. She never saw him again. The escape across the Pyrenees was a nightmare journey that took 6 attempts over 3 months. Nazi patrols had intensified in the mountains. Guide networks had been compromised. Weather was brutal. Nancy made it to within sight of the Spanish border 4 times before having to turn back when patrols appeared. On the 5th attempt, their guide was arrested, and the group scattered in the mountains. Nancy survived by walking for 3 days through snow without food, navigating by stars when clouds cleared, eventually stumbling into a Spanish village more dead than alive. She reached England in April 1944, just 2 months before D-Day. British intelligence debriefed her extensively about the French resistance, her networks, her knowledge of German operations in southern France. Then they offered her a position with the Special Operations Executive, the organization that trained agents for sabotage and resistance coordination behind enemy lines. Most SOE training took months. Nancy had 6 weeks before they needed her in France. She compressed the training program, learning parachute drops, weapons handling, explosives, codes, everything an SOE agent needed to survive in occupied territory. Her instructors noted that she showed absolutely no fear during training exercises, that she approached potentially lethal situations with cheerful aggression that bordered on reckless. In April 1944, Nancy parachuted back into France as part of a team tasked with coordinating resistance in the Auvergne region ahead of the Allied invasion. She was 31 years old, one of the very few women operating as armed SOE agents in the field, and she was returning to a country where the Gestapo was actively searching for the White Mouse. For the next year, she lived in forests and safe houses, coordinating resistance groups that she helped transform from scattered cells into effective military units. She led attacks on German installations, organized supply drops, trained resistance fighters in weapons and tactics, and personally killed German soldiers in firefights when operations went wrong. On one occasion, her group ambushed a German convoy, but the attack stalled when the machine gunner was killed. Nancy grabbed the machine gun, a weapon she'd barely trained with, and held position firing at German soldiers until the rest of her team could reorganize and complete the attack. On another, when the Gestapo surrounded a safe house where she was meeting with resistance leaders, she escaped by charging directly at the German cordon, firing a pistol and screaming in French, so unexpected that confused Germans hesitated long enough for her to break through and disappear into side streets. She killed a German sentry with her bare hands when an operation required silent elimination, and the designated fighter couldn't do it. She bicycled over 500 kilometers in 72 hours through German-occupied territory to re-establish communication when radio equipment was destroyed, arriving so exhausted she collapsed and slept for 20 hours. She commanded a group of over 7,000 resistance fighters by war's end, coordinating operations that killed or captured over 2,400 German soldiers and destroyed infrastructure crucial to Nazi logistics in central France. The Gestapo never stopped hunting for the White Mouse. They had her name by 1944, knew Nancy Wake was the woman they'd interviewed at Avenue Foch, realized she'd deceived them and escaped. They arrested Avenue Foch in 1943 and tortured him for months trying to extract information about his wife's location and contacts. Henri, who had begged Nancy to stay safe, who had been terrified of exactly this outcome, never revealed anything. The Gestapo executed him in October 1943. Nancy didn't learn about his death until after the war ended. When she finally received the news, she understood the cost of the choice she'd made. Henry had died because she'd chosen to fight, because her resistance work had eventually drawn Gestapo attention to him, because the interrogators at Avenue Foch had let her walk out but continued investigating. She carried that guilt for the rest of her life, even though she never regretted the decision to fight. She believed, and argued until her death, that defeating Nazism required sacrifices, and that comfortable people like her and Henri had moral obligation to risk everything rather than accommodate evil through silence. After the war, Nancy Wake was decorated by multiple governments. France awarded her the Médaille de la Résistance, the Croix de Guerre with 2 palms, and made her a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur. Britain gave her the Georges Medal. The United States awarded her the Medal of Freedom. She received more combat decorations than any other woman in World War II, but she struggled enormously in peacetime. She had nightmares about Henri's death, about the people she'd killed, about the moments during the war when she'd made decisions that cost lives. She drank heavily, moved restlessly between countries, worked various jobs without finding purpose that matched what she'd felt during the war. She married again in 1957, an RAF officer named John Forward, who understood her nightmares because he had his own. They lived quietly in Australia for decades, Nancy rarely speaking about her war experiences, giving occasional interviews where she downplayed her own courage and emphasized the bravery of resistance fighters who'd died. She was matter-of-fact about having killed German soldiers, explaining that they were trying to kill her and her comrades, that war made such actions necessary, that she'd do it all again if faced with the same evil. In her 80s, she gave more extensive interviews, perhaps sensing that her generation's direct memories of the war would die with them. She described walking into Avenue Foch with absolute clarity, explaining that she'd been terrified but couldn't show it, that the performance had been the most important 3 hours of her life. She talked about the interrogators' faces when she offered them cigarettes, the moment she realized they were wavering, the walk out of the building when she'd wanted to run but forced herself to move slowly like nothing had happened. She explained her philosophy simply. Fear was irrelevant. What mattered was action. You could be afraid and still fight. You could be certain you would die and still walk forward. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something mattered more than fear. For her, what mattered more was defeating Nazism, protecting the people Hitler wanted to exterminate, making the bastards pay for every meter of French soil they occupied. She used exactly that language in interviews, unfiltered and profane, still angry about the occupation even 70 years later. Nancy Wake died in London in 2011 at age 98. She had outlived nearly everyone she'd fought with and against, had seen the world she'd fought for transformed in ways she sometimes approved of and sometimes found bewildering. Her funeral was attended by intelligence officers, historians, and the few surviving resistance members who'd worked with her. They told stories about her fearlessness, her refusal to accept any mission as impossible, her ability to make desperate situations seem like adventures rather than potential death sentences. The story of Nancy Wake matters because it demonstrates what one person can accomplish when they decide that moral conviction requires action regardless of risk. She wasn't a soldier, had no military training before joining the resistance, came from a background of privilege that could have insulated her from the war's worst impacts. She chose to fight anyway, chose to risk torture and execution, chose to sacrifice her marriage and her safety because she believed that accommodation with evil was itself a form of evil. The moment she walked into SS headquarters at Avenue Foch represents the distilled essence of that choice. She knew the risks, knew that one mistake would mean agonizing death, knew that running was the rational decision. She went anyway because the alternative was abandoning the resistance networks that depended on her, condemning her husband and friends to retaliation, accepting defeat. So she put on expensive clothes, walked through doors that swallowed people whole, sat across from SS interrogators, and performed innocence so convincingly that they let her walk back out into Paris sunlight. That performance saved her life and allowed her to continue operations that eventually helped liberate France. But it came at terrible cost. Henri died in Gestapo custody, friends were executed, people she'd worked with were arrested and tortured, some of them breaking under interrogation and condemning others. The resistance work she continued after escaping France put thousands at risk, and killed hundreds of German soldiers in operations where she personally pulled triggers and threw grenades. She made choices that haunted her for 70 years after the war ended. But she made those choices consciously, understanding consequences, accepting moral weight. She argued that the alternative, safety through neutrality, was worse. That privileged people who could have fought but chose comfort were complicit in every atrocity the Nazis committed. That her dead husband would have understood and approved, even though it killed him. That the guilt she carried was appropriate price for having survived when so many hadn't. The woman who walked into Nazi headquarters and walked out alive did so through courage that most people cannot imagine possessing. But Nancy Wake insisted she wasn't exceptional, that thousands of ordinary people made similar choices during the war, that courage was common, but circumstances to display it were rare. She believed that most people, confronted with genuine evil and genuine choice, would find strength they didn't know they possessed. Her life was evidence that she might be right. That soft-living journalist who loved parties and pretty clothes could transform into fighter who killed with her hands when circumstances demanded it. Avenue Foch still stands in Paris, elegant building that held so much horror. Tourists walk past without knowing that torture rooms once operated in the basement, that interrogation rooms on upper floors broke hundreds of people who never walked back out. Nancy Wake walked out because she understood that authority is performance, that fear is contagious, that projecting absolute confidence can create doubt in people expecting to see terror. She performed the role of innocent socialite perfectly enough to survive the most dangerous 3 hours of her life, then continued fighting until the war ended and the Nazis who'd occupied her beloved France were destroyed or dead. That's the story worth remembering. Not just the courage, but the choice. The deliberate decision to walk into danger when escape was possible, to risk everything when safe alternatives existed, to fight when fighting might mean death. Nancy Wake made that choice again and again for 5 years, and it cost her husband, her peace of mind, and decades of nightmares. She said she'd do it all again without hesitation. That unwavering conviction, maintained until her death at 98, is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about her. She never doubted that the fight was worth the cost. She never questioned whether one person could make a difference. She simply walked through the doors of Avenue Foch and proved that sometimes courage and performance and absolute refusal to show fear can defeat organizations built on terror. And then she walked back out and kept fighting until there was nothing left to fight.